Every year, my family somehow forgot to invite me to Christmas. No calls. No messages. No explanations. I told myself it didn't hurt, until I saw the photos online. This year, I stopped waiting. I booked a mountain house and planned to spend Christmas alone, finally choosing peace. But on Christmas Eve, my phone started buzzing with strange messages asking where I was. Then my security app sent an alert. Cars were pulling into my driveway. It was my family. They weren't there to celebrate. They were looking for something. And I was watching everything. Every year, Christmas arrived the same way for me, quietly, without warning, and without an invitation. No call. No message. No awkward explanation. Just silence that I had learned to recognize too well. I would mark the date on my calendar anyway, not because I expected anything to change, but because hope has a stubborn way of lingering. At first, I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe they assumed someone else had told me. Maybe the group chat didn't include me. Those excuses worked for a while, especially when I wanted them to. But year after year, the pattern repeated itself with uncomfortable consistency. I'd find out the same way every time. A photo posted late in the evening. Smiling faces around a table I wasn't sitting at. Familiar decorations in a house I hadn't been invited into. Someone would comment, "Best Christmas ever," and I'd stare at the screen longer than I should have. What hurt wasn't just being left out. It was how easily everyone moved on without noticing my absence. No one asked where I was. No one checked in. I was forgotten in a way that felt intentional, even if no one ever admitted it. I learned how to make it look like I didn't care. I worked late. I cooked for myself. I told friends I preferred quiet holidays. On the outside, I looked independent and unaffected. On the inside, I felt like a relative people only remembered when they needed something. By the time this Christmas approached, the silence didn't surprise me anymore. It felt familiar. Expected. Almost routine. But something was different this year. For the first time, instead of waiting to see if anyone would remember me, I stopped waiting altogether. And that small shift, deciding not to wait, changed everything that followed. Each year, I repeated the same quiet lie to myself. It doesn't matter. I said it casually, like it was a fact instead of a defense mechanism. I told myself I was busy, that I preferred being alone, that holidays were overrated anyway. Saying it out loud made it sound convincing. I'd scroll past the photos quickly, pretending they didn't sting. The matching pajamas. The crowded table. The inside jokes frozen in captions I wasn't part of. I convinced myself I didn't belong there anymore, that people grow apart and this was just what adulthood looked like. Sometimes I even defended them to others. If someone asked why I wasn't with my family, I'd shrug and say plans didn't line up. I didn't want pity. I didn't want questions. Mostly, I didn't want to admit how small it made me feel to be excluded so consistently. The lie worked best when I stayed distracted. Work helped. So did routines. If I kept moving, I didn't have to sit with the quiet realization that being forgotten hurts more when it happens repeatedly. Once is an accident. A pattern is a message. Late at night, though, when there was nothing to scroll through and nowhere else to be, the lie fell apart. I'd think about how much effort it takes to include someone, and how little effort it takes to forget them. The imbalance stayed with me. What hurt most wasn't the lack of an invitation. It was the absence of curiosity. No one ever asked if I had plans. No one wondered where I was spending the day. It was as if my presence wasn't missed because it wasn't expected. By the time this Christmas came around, the lie didn't comfort me anymore. It felt thin. Fragile. And for the first time, I admitted something I'd avoided for years: it did matter. And pretending otherwise was costing me more than I realized. The breaking point didn't come from a dramatic argument or a cruel message. It came quietly, on an ordinary evening, while I was scrolling through my phone without thinking. A familiar house filled my screen, warm lights, a decorated tree, my family gathered close together. The caption read, "Christmas came early this year." I stared at the photo longer than I should have. It wasn't just that I wasn't there. It was how complete the moment looked without me. No space left open. No sense that someone was missing. That's when the numbness cracked. I realized I had been waiting for people who weren't waiting for me. Year after year, I'd left emotional room for an invitation that never came. I'd stayed available, just in case someone remembered. That quiet hope had kept me stuck. Something in me shifted. Not anger, clarity. I saw the pattern for what it was, not what I'd been pretending it wasn't. Forgetting once is accidental. Forgetting every year is a decision, even if no one says it out loud. I set my phone down and sat in the silence. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to reach out or explain myself. I didn't feel like reminding anyone I existed. The idea exhausted me. That's when I made a decision I'd never made before. I wasn't going to wait and see what happened. I wasn't going to hover around the edges of someone else's plans. I was going to make my own, without leaving room for disappointment. The thought felt unfamiliar and strangely empowering. It meant accepting something I'd resisted for years, that my place in their lives was conditional, and I was tired of meeting conditions no one had ever discussed with me. That night, I opened my laptop and started searching for somewhere else to be. Somewhere far enough away that I wouldn't be tempted to check my phone or wonder if anyone would call. That's how the idea of the mountain house first appeared on my screen. Booking the mountain house felt impulsive at first. My finger hovered over the screen longer than necessary, like I was waiting for permission I knew wouldn't come. It wasn't cheap. It wasn't practical. And it definitely wasn't what I'd pictured doing for Christmas in the past. But that was the point. I was done shaping my decisions around people who didn't factor me into theirs. So I confirmed the booking and felt a quiet rush of relief settle in my chest. The decision was mine alone, and for once, it didn't need approval. The place was remote, surrounded by trees and snow, miles away from anything familiar. No neighbors close enough to overhear anything. No expectations. Just space. I told myself it would be peaceful. A reset. Time to breathe without bracing for disappointment. As soon as the reservation went through, I noticed something unexpected: guilt. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because I'd done something for myself without considering how it might affect anyone else. That feeling lingered longer than I expected. I started to understand how deeply I'd been conditioned to wait. To remain available. To leave emotional doors unlocked, just in case someone finally knocked. Choosing myself felt unfamiliar because I hadn't practiced it. I didn't announce my plans. I didn't hint or drop clues. I let the silence exist on its own. If anyone noticed I was unavailable this year, they didn't say so. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Instead of preparing to be forgotten, I started preparing to leave. I bought groceries meant for one. I planned long walks. I pictured mornings without my phone lighting up with reminders of what I wasn't part of. For the first time, Christmas wasn't something I was waiting to survive. It was something I was actively shaping. And even though I didn't realize it yet, that choice was about to expose more than just my independence. It was about to reveal why I'd been forgotten in the first place. The days leading up to the trip were slower than usual. I packed deliberately, choosing comfort over appearances. Thick sweaters. Books I'd been meaning to read for years. Food that didn't need to be shared or justified. Every item felt like a small act of intention. The drive up the mountain was long and quiet. Cell service faded mile by mile, and with it, the constant hum of expectation. The road narrowed, the trees grew denser, and snow covered everything in a clean, uninterrupted blanket. By the time I arrived, the world felt smaller in a good way. The house was exactly as advertised, wood-paneled, simple, tucked away from everything. I unlocked the door and stepped into silence so complete it almost rang. No background noise. No voices. Just the soft creak of the floor and the wind outside. I unpacked slowly, letting the quiet settle. I lit a fire and watched it catch, the flames filling the room with warmth. It felt strange to prepare a holiday meal for one person, but also oddly grounding. There was no pressure to impress. No schedule to follow. That first evening, I sat by the window with a mug in my hands and watched snow fall steadily from the sky. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder what anyone else was doing. The peace felt earned, like something I'd waited years to allow myself. Still, there was a faint unease I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was habit. A part of me kept listening for something, an interruption, a reminder, a pull back into old patterns. Before going to bed, I walked through the house and double-checked the locks. It felt unnecessary, but comforting. The place was secluded, and the quiet had a way of amplifying every sound. As I turned off the lights, I told myself this would be a calm Christmas. Just me, the snow, and the quiet I'd chosen. I didn't know yet how wrong that assumption would be. It happened the next morning, just as the house was starting to feel familiar. I was making coffee, watching steam rise into the cold air, when my phone vibrated on the counter. The sound felt louder than it should have in the quiet space. The message was short. Too short. "Where are you?" It wasn't followed by a greeting or a name. Just that. I stared at the screen, confused. No one ever asked where I was on Christmas. Not like this. Not urgently. I didn't respond right away. I waited, half expecting another message to explain it. None came. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. A missed call. Same number. A family member who hadn't contacted me in months. That's when the unease set in. Not fear, confusion. Why now? Why after years of silence? I replayed past Christmases in my head, searching for precedent. There wasn't one. I typed a reply, then erased it. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for where I chose to be. Still, something about the timing felt off. This wasn't concern. It felt like urgency, misplaced and unexplained. Another message came through. "Call me." No warmth. No apology. No acknowledgement of the distance that had existed until now. Just a demand, wrapped in familiarity. I set the phone down and finished my coffee, trying to shake the tight feeling in my chest. The mountain was quiet. Too quiet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, undisturbed. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone needed something simple. Maybe they'd finally remembered me for the wrong reason. That thought lingered longer than I liked. Before leaving the kitchen, I glanced at the security app on my phone, just out of habit. All cameras were clear. No alerts. No movement. At the time, I took that as reassurance. I didn't know yet that the message wasn't the beginning of contact. It was a warning. The cameras weren't something I installed on a whim. They were the result of a long history of learning not to assume the best when people had already shown me who they were. Trust, for me, had become something earned slowly, especially with family. A few years earlier, there had been an incident. Nothing dramatic enough to call the police, nothing obvious enough to talk about openly. Just enough crossed boundaries to teach me that privacy wasn't always respected, especially when people felt entitled. When I bought the mountain house, installing cameras felt like a precaution, not paranoia. The property was remote. Help was far away. I wanted to know what was happening outside before it became my problem inside. I placed them carefully: front door, back entrance, driveway. Not to watch people, but to protect my space. The setup was simple, discreet, and synced to my phone. Once it was done, I barely thought about it again. That morning, after the strange messages, I found myself opening the app without really deciding to. My thumb moved on instinct. Every camera showed the same thing: snow, trees, stillness. No tracks. No movement. I told myself I was overthinking. Being alone can make your thoughts louder. Isolation has a way of amplifying doubts until they sound like intuition. Still, I kept the app open longer than usual. I adjusted a setting. Checked the battery levels. Little things, done absent-mindedly, as if my body knew something my mind hadn't accepted yet. Family history teaches you patterns if you pay attention. Silence followed by sudden urgency. Absence followed by demands. I'd seen it before. I just hadn't wanted to name it. I set the phone down and tried to focus on the present: the fire crackling, the warmth of the house, the quiet I'd come here for. But the sense of calm I'd felt earlier had thinned. The cameras stayed quiet. No alerts. No movement. Everything looked normal. That's what made it worse. Because the instinct that something was coming didn't leave, it settled in, patient and alert, waiting for the moment it would be proven right. The alert came just after sunset, when the sky had turned that deep blue that makes everything feel colder and farther away. My phone vibrated once on the coffee table. Then again. The sound cut through the quiet like a knock I hadn't invited. Motion detected, driveway. I stared at the screen, unsure if I'd read it correctly. The driveway was long and rarely used. No one passed through accidentally. I opened the app, my heart beating slower than I expected, like my body was bracing itself. The camera feed loaded slowly. Snow-covered ground came into view, then headlights cutting through the darkness. A car pulled in and stopped. Another followed behind it. 2 vehicles. Familiar shapes. Familiar timing. For a moment, I didn't recognize them. Then the door opened, and I saw the way one of them moved: impatient, purposeful. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a stranger. It was my family. I watched as they stepped out of the cars, looking around like they owned the place. No hesitation. No confusion. They hadn't asked where I was to check on me. They'd asked because they were already on their way. I muted the sound and kept watching. Someone walked toward the front door. Someone else circled the side of the house, checking the windows. They weren't carrying gifts. They weren't smiling. This wasn't a visit. The cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the kind that settles when realization hits all at once. They hadn't come to invite me after all. They'd come looking for something. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I watched them test the handle on the door. I watched one of them lean in close, peering through the glass. The alert vibrated again. Motion detected, back entrance. That was when the quiet Christmas I'd planned officially ended. I sank slowly onto the couch, phone clenched in my hand, eyes locked on the screen. It felt unreal, like I was watching footage from someone else's life. The people moving outside weren't strangers. They were familiar in ways that made the scene harder to process. One of them knocked on the front door, not politely, not patiently. It was sharp, impatient, like they expected an answer immediately. Another voice called my name, loud enough to carry through the trees. There was no warmth in it. No concern. Just urgency. I switched between camera angles, my thumb trembling slightly. At the back entrance, someone was brushing snow away from the steps, checking for footprints. Another was pacing near the windows, peering inside, trying to see past the curtains. They moved with purpose, not uncertainty. That's when it hit me. They hadn't forgotten me this year. They had remembered me very clearly, only not for the reason family should. Whatever had brought them here, it wasn't love or regret. It was need. I thought back to the strange message that morning. "Where are you?" It hadn't been concern. It had been logistics. They needed to know if the house was empty. My chest tightened as I watched one of them pull out a phone and make a call. Seconds later, my own phone buzzed again. I let it ring. I wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. They talked among themselves, gesturing toward the house, toward the cars. I couldn't hear their words, but I recognized the body language: frustration, impatience, entitlement. It was the same energy I'd seen in smaller moments over the years, now magnified. I realized then how vulnerable I would have been without the cameras. How easily this could have turned into a surprise confrontation. How intentional their timing was: Christmas Eve, when they assumed I'd be desperate enough to answer the door. Instead, I was watching from a distance. Safe. Invisible. The power shift was subtle but undeniable. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't trying to earn kindness. I was simply observing who they were when they thought I wasn't looking. And what I saw confirmed something I'd been avoiding for years. As I kept watching, pieces started to fall into place. Their movements weren't random. They weren't searching for me, they were searching around me. One of them pointed toward the shed near the tree line. Another shook their head and gestured back at the house, frustrated. That's when I remembered the conversation from months earlier. A passing comment about the property. About what it was worth. About how lucky I was to have found it when I did. At the time, I'd brushed it off as idle curiosity. Now it felt like a blueprint. They believed I had something here. Something valuable. Something they felt entitled to access. Not because I'd offered it, because in their minds, what was mine had always been negotiable. I watched one of them crouch near a window, trying to look inside. Another tugged on the door again, harder this time. No knocking now. No pretending this was a visit. The urgency had sharpened into irritation. My phone buzzed again. A voicemail notification. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. I already knew the tone: concern layered over demand, disguised as family obligation. The realization settled heavily in my chest. They hadn't come to include me. They hadn't come to apologize. They'd come because they thought I was alone, forgotten, and therefore accessible. It wasn't about money alone. It was about control. About assuming that my absence from family gatherings meant my boundaries were still flexible. That I could be pressured, cornered, convinced. I felt something solidify inside me. Not fear, resolve. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated assumption based on years of me staying quiet, staying available, staying forgiving. One of them kicked lightly at the snow in frustration. Another checked their phone again. Time was passing, and they hadn't gotten what they came for. They didn't realize it yet, but they weren't searching for something I owed them. They were exposing exactly why I'd never been invited in the first place. The shift from impatience to action happened fast. One moment they were pacing, checking phones, whispering sharply to one another. The next, someone reached for the door again, this time with both hands. I watched the handle turn, stop, then turn harder. My breath caught, even though I was safe inside. The sound didn't reach me, but I could imagine it, the dull rattle of metal against metal, the frustration building with each failed attempt. This wasn't concern anymore. It was entitlement turning aggressive. One of them stepped back and said something I couldn't hear. Another shook their head and moved toward a side window. They tried lifting it slightly, testing how much resistance there was. It was clumsy, rushed, and fueled by the assumption that no one was watching. I felt strangely detached, like my emotions had gone quiet to make room for clarity. This was no longer family drama. This was a line being crossed, clearly and deliberately. I thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd answered the message that morning. If I'd stayed in the city. If I hadn't installed cameras. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the snow outside. My phone buzzed again. Another call. I declined it without hesitation. Talking would only give them what they wanted: access. Control. A chance to rewrite what was happening. Instead, I opened another app and made a different call. My voice was calm when I spoke, steady in a way that surprised even me. I described the location. The activity. The fact that people were attempting to enter a property without permission. Outside, one of them looked directly at the camera for the first time. Their face froze for a split second, just long enough to suggest suspicion. Then they turned away, speaking urgently to the others. They still didn't know I was watching. But they were about to realize they weren't as alone as they thought. That I stayed exactly where I was while the call connected, eyes never leaving the screen. I didn't announce myself. I didn't step outside. I didn't give them the reaction they were clearly expecting. I let the process handle what emotion couldn't. I explained the situation calmly: remote property, multiple individuals, attempted entry. The words felt clinical, almost distant, but that distance helped. It kept me grounded while everything outside continued to unravel. While I spoke, the camera showed them arguing now. One person gestured sharply toward the road, another toward the house. The urgency had shifted. Whatever confidence they'd arrived with was thinning, replaced by irritation and something close to panic. I ended the call and muted my phone. There was nothing more to say. The next move wasn't mine to make. That realization felt oddly freeing. Minutes passed slowly. Snow continued to fall, indifferent to the tension unfolding beneath it. One of them tried the door again, half-hearted this time. Another kept checking the road, scanning the darkness like they were suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Then headlights appeared in the distance. Not theirs. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped. Bodies stiffened. Someone swore and stepped back from the door. Another raised a hand to shield their eyes as the lights grew brighter. They knew. The authority vehicle pulled in and stopped, clean and unmistakable against the snow. Doors opened. Voices carried faintly through the trees, firm and unyielding. My family's posture changed instantly, shoulders lowered, hands raised slightly, explanations forming before questions were even asked. I watched it all without moving. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just confirmation. This wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries finally being enforced by something stronger than expectation or guilt. For the first time, the narrative wasn't being rewritten around me. It was being recorded exactly as it happened. And there would be consequences, quiet, official, unavoidable. From the moment the officers stepped out, everything changed. The confidence my family had arrived with collapsed into something awkward and defensive. They spoke all at once, hands moving too much, voices too loud for a situation that no longer belonged to them. I watched as explanations spilled out, half-truths wrapped in familiarity. They pointed at the house. At the cars. At the snow-covered ground. They used my name more times in those few minutes than they had all year, like invoking it might soften the situation. One of them glanced directly at the camera again. This time, there was no doubt. They knew someone was watching. They just didn't realize how much had already been seen. An officer walked the perimeter, checking doors, inspecting the window they'd tried to force. Another stood back, listening without reacting. The calm professionalism was stark against the frantic energy my family gave off. I noticed something else then. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked where I was. Their concern wasn't about my safety. It was about consequences. Phones came out. IDs were handed over. Voices dropped in volume. The story shifted from urgency to apology, from entitlement to confusion. Watching it unfold felt surreal, like witnessing a long-standing illusion finally crack. At one point, an officer looked up toward the camera, then back at them. That single gesture seemed to confirm what they feared most, that this situation wasn't private, wasn't flexible, and couldn't be talked away. When they were told to leave, there was resistance at first. Questions. Objections. Then acceptance. One by one, they returned to their cars, movements stiff and quiet. As engines started, someone looked back at the house. Not with regret, but with calculation, as if already planning what they'd say later, how they'd reframe what had happened. I didn't wave. I didn't call. I didn't step outside. I stayed where I was, watching the taillights disappear into the dark, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Safety. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos before it. Once the cars disappeared and the alert stopped, the house settled back into stillness, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet I'd arrived with. This one felt earned. My phone started lighting up almost immediately. Missed calls. Voicemails. Messages layered with concern that arrived too late to feel genuine. Apologies followed explanations, then justifications. The tone shifted again and again, searching for something that would make me respond. I didn't listen to the voicemails right away. I didn't need to. I already knew the story they would tell: confusion, worry, misunderstandings. None of it addressed what I'd watched unfold with my own eyes. When I finally read the messages, one thing stood out. Not a single one asked how I felt. They asked if I was okay now. If I was angry. If we could talk this through. The focus was still on smoothing things over, not acknowledging what had happened. I responded once. Briefly. I told them I needed space and that what occurred wasn't acceptable. I didn't explain further. I didn't argue. I didn't invite debate. That boundary alone seemed to unsettle them more than the officers had. The messages slowed, then stopped altogether. Silence returned, but this time it was intentional. In the days that followed, I replayed the footage in my mind, not obsessively, but with clarity. Seeing the truth removes the ability to minimize it. There was no version of events where their behavior could be reframed as care. What surprised me most wasn't the betrayal. It was how calm I felt once I stopped trying to interpret their actions kindly. Acceptance brought peace faster than denial ever had. By the time Christmas morning arrived, I didn't feel lonely. I felt resolved. The mountain outside was untouched, the sky clear and pale. And for the first time, the holiday belonged entirely to me. That Christmas changed something fundamental in me. Not because of the fear, or even the confrontation, but because of the clarity that followed. I finally saw what waiting had been costing me. Waiting to be remembered. Waiting to be included. Waiting to be chosen by people who had already made their priorities clear. I realized how often I'd measured my worth by other people's availability. How I'd left emotional space open for years, hoping someone would step into it. Letting go of that habit felt uncomfortable at first, like standing without support. But it also felt honest. Family, I learned, isn't defined by proximity or obligation. It's defined by respect. By boundaries that aren't tested. By presence that doesn't need to be demanded. Anyone who only shows up when they want something isn't showing up for you. I stopped waiting for invitations after that. Not just to holidays, but to conversations, to validation, to belonging. I started building a life where my peace didn't depend on anyone else remembering me. The mountain house became a symbol of that shift, not isolation, but choice. A reminder that being alone by decision feels very different from being left out by design. I don't know what story my family tells now. I don't need to. The truth doesn't require consensus. It only requires acceptance. What I do know is this: I will never again make myself small to stay connected. I will never sit quietly, hoping someone notices my absence. If I'm invited, it will be because I'm wanted, not because someone finally remembered I exist. And if I'm not, I already know how to choose myself.